So before going on to lesson 5, I'm going to cover the ways of counting days and general time. So first, we'll cover the words themselves. He is one of those words I've been warning you about where on its own, it's flat, and when it's modified, it becomes odaka. Well, since it's a single more, I guess it would be atamadaka. Bear that in mind here. Shu is accented high-low. Tsuki for month is final high. Tsukiga. Which shouldn't be a terrible issue as it's devoicing the tsu. So you're probably already saying it pretty much like that. Toshi is also odaka, final high, but there's a much higher chance you've been saying this wrong as toshi, but it's not. It's toshi. Toshiga. Toshiwa. Moving on to days, I'll first warn you that anything beyond toka is going to be very chaotic. I was trying to check through examples to see if there's any kind of rules I could get. I think there's a general tendency to have them be odaka past toka, but it's not very reliable. There were some people that would pronounce day 14 as juyokka. Some of them would pronounce it as juyokka, and I've heard from a friend that it's actually more common to say juyonnichi as a nakadaka word. So with these, there's not a whole bunch we can do. I will warn you that hatsuka is flat. It's just hatsuka ni. That being said, we can memorize the first 10 days, and it's not terribly hard, as with the exception of tsuitachi, which is final high, tsuitachi ni. They are all flat. Toka wa kokonoka ni. So, boom, you've got these down. And now we can go on to months. And once again, we're in luck because you can just memorize that they are all odaka. 1月に、2月に, except for 3月, atamadaka, 5月 also, and 9月, same deal. So if you remember that 3月, 5月, and 9月 are initial high, atamadaka, then if you also remember that the rest of the months are final high, then you've got the months down. And that's only 4 bits of information instead of 12. So, kospa ga ii. And then we're going to move on to time words. Now, I talked in the previous part about my ideas about adverbs and how they become nouns on the subject of kino or kino, depending on context. So this applies the same way to ototoi. When it's said as a pure adverb, it is flat. When it's followed by a particle or in general is being used as a noun, it is ototoi. So pay attention to this. Luckily, these next few don't have to worry about as much. Kyo is high-low, and there's nothing really fancy happening here. Ashita is final high, so you have to make sure you are keeping track of this. So ashita ni, ashita wa. And then asatte is nakadaka, middle high, which shouldn't be terribly difficult. And if we go to these mae words, we're in luck because these fuse into a single long word, which has the accent on ma, as I believe I've explained before. So, 2週間前, 2ヶ月前. So, we don't have to worry about those. And as we go down the weeks real quick, they are all flat. Senshu, konshu, raishu, saraishu, there are no accents here. These have long syllables, but don't mistake that for accents. These are all flat. And then going on to months, it gets a little trickier because we have sengetsu for last month, but then kongetsu for this month is flat. So sengetsu for last month is atamadaka, first high, or initial high. Kongetsu is flat, and then daigetsu for next month is atamadaka, accented. And then the month after next has 2 different pronunciations. It can be pronounced as saraigetsu, or it could also be pronounced saraigetsu. Both are perfectly fine. Take your pick. Moving on to the year words, we have ototoshi, which is nakadaka, so ototoshi. And unlike ototoi, it does not have any of the weird adverb changes. It's always ototoshi. So we're in luck here. Kyonen is atamadaka. It is head high. Kyonen. Good to remember. And it's not kyonen. Remember how I've been talking about these long syllables. It's not kyonen, but kyonen. This year, or kotoshi, is flat. Nothing fancy here, just kotoshi. Rainen is flat. And don't get this mixed up with raigetsu. Rainen is flat, which is a good place to mention that one of the trickiest parts of Japanese tone is that it's word by word, not morpheme by morpheme. So I know people who studied Chinese, in which case a character will typically have a single pronunciation, and that pronunciation always has the same tone. And of course, we know that's not the case in Japanese. Besides having multiple pronunciations per character, each pronunciation also has multiple different tones depending on the word we see it in. So as we can see here, the same character with the same-ish pronunciation in next week can be daishu, next year it can be dainen, and then in next month it's daigetsu. It's a completely different tone. And this is just something you're going to have to think about. Even if you can hear a character and its pronunciation in your head, doesn't mean it's the right tone, because there's a perfectly good chance you're remembering it from a word where it has a different tone than the one where you're seeing it. And then sarainen, nothing special here, just flat. And this should pretty much wrap up these. So let's go on to the words for this chapter, for chapter 5. So right off the bat, we've got some relatively interesting ones. So tabemono and nomimono have two acceptable pronunciations, which are quite close. It can be tabemono or tabemono. There has to be an accent there. It has to be nakadaka. But it can be either on the second or the third from the end or from the beginning. Same difference. While that's the pattern for both tabemono and nomimono, for kudamono, it has to be in the da. You can't say kudamono. That sounds strange. So with kudamono, you have to say kudamono. I could not find any examples of people saying kudamono, even with the little delays that happen in Japanese pitch accent. It really seems to be right there on the da, and it doesn't change. So kudamono. And then we got on to yasumi, which is odaka. So final high, yasumi ni, yasumi wa. And this is actually part of a broader rule, which can help us quite a bit. So yasumi comes from the verb yasumu, which is accented yasumu, not yasumu, but yasumu. And what happens when and yasumu is a three-mora U verb, which is accented. And what happens when U verbs, which are accented and are three-mora or less, become nouns is the accent moves to the end. Now, that's a bit abstract, and there were a lot of rules there, but we can actually explain it a bit better with some examples. So, for instance, kaeru, when we turn this into a noun, for instance, as we've heard said in club, for instance, kaeri wa daijoubu? Kaeri wa, not kaeri wa, but kaeri wa, because the accent from kaeru, when it becomes a noun, goes onto the ri, kaeri wa. Same way here, yasumu becomes yasumi, like yasumi ni. And this happens for other words of the same type. For instance, katsu becomes kachida. I know we've heard that a lot if we're weebs at all. Ori no kachida, right? But there are other examples such as hanasu becoming hanashiwa, right? And rather than trying to memorize all the rules I talked about earlier for the places where this can happen, it's probably faster just to memorize the exceptions. So exception 1 is words that are longer than 4. This stops being reliable. There are a few words that are like this, but not a whole lot. One of them is yorokobu, which becomes yorokobi, which is flat. You don't say yorokobi wa, sorry, you don't say yorokobi wa, you say yorokobi wa. So this doesn't apply to words like that. And there is one exception where a word meets all these conditions and it doesn't happen, which is hokoru, to be proud of, which becomes the flat hokori. It does not have an accent. That's the only real exception that I've run into, at least. But in general, this is a very good rule to remember. If it'll let you knock out a whole class of nouns or verbs, depending on which way you're learning the relationship. So very good to keep in mind. The sort of tricky thing here, but also the real benefit to knowing this rule, is it actually lets you understand the grammar of what's being said better. Because I mentioned when these turn into nouns, it moves to the end. But you can also nominalize these verbs without them becoming nouns. In that case, the accent stays in the same place. And you'll have to learn which situations you turn it into a noun and which situations you're just sort of taking away the verbness of it. For instance, in a single show, you might hear somebody say kachi ni kita, right? But they'll also say kachi da, jibun no kachi da. I don't think anybody would say jibun there, but in either case, when you're saying kachi ni kita or something along those lines that's using kachi, that's using like the ni, like shi ni kita, that form, the accent does not move to the end. It stays where it was because it's not becoming a full noun. And in the same way, when you're using it in a more, basically like a more literary version of the te form, this also doesn't happen. So for instance, if you were trying to be very literary when explaining your afternoon, you could say something like, tomodachi to hanashi, and then you go on from there, which means something basically the same as tomodachi to hanashite, and then continuing. But in this case, it does not become tomodachi to hanashi, it becomes hanashi, because we're not completely turning it into a noun there. So that's sort of a tricky thing, because if you're not hearing the tones, it looks like the same thing, but it's not. So I know that's a lot to take in, but just be on the lookout for that if you can. Ryoko for travel. Refreshingly, there's nothing interesting here. It's just flat. Ryoko. Umi is atamadaka, and again, nothing crazy, just umi. So then we get to surfing, which has an accent at the very beginning. It's surfing. It does not seem to lose its accent. I've looked and I have not found anybody saying surfing, so stick to saying surfing. Shouldn't be terribly hard. I mean, it's more or less what we're used to. Then we get on to omiyage, which is flat. No accents here. Basu, and this is accented. And I haven't, again, heard anybody flatten this word, so just stick to basu. Moving on to tenki, which is atamadaka tenki. Nothing to see here, actually. It's just tenki. Shukudai, again, nothing to worry about here. It's just flat. Moving on to testo, which is atamadaka and does not seem to lose its accent. So stick to testo. Then you get the tanjoubi, which like the other... and then we get the tanjoubi, which is nakadaka tanjoubi. Accent on the jo, tanjoubi. Nothing really insane here. Heya for room is odaka, so heya wa heya ni iru, right? So make sure to remember to put that accent on the ya, heya wa heya da. And then finally we're to another interesting word, which is boku. There are two acceptable accents, but only one is in dictionaries. You're going to see in your dictionary boku, but in addition to real life, it's often said as boku. So what's happening here, well, obviously there are two accents. The sense I get from this word is boku, high-low, is more polite, more, what would you say, respectful, whereas boku is a bit more confident and masculine, but not terribly far. So maybe that's not the way natives would feel about these two pronunciations, but again, it's going to be hard to find resources about that. Of course, you can ask the exchange students, and I'm sure they'd be happy to answer. But just know there are these two pronunciations, and both are fine. And picking your first-person pronoun is always going to be a bit of a struggle for us, but just know the options you've got. Erusaizu. Again, 3 from the end. Nakadaka. Nothing surprising here. Erusaizu. And then we go on to e-adjectives. Now there's a rule in Tokyo or standard Japanese where an accented e-adjective has to have the accent 1 from the end. It's the same rule as with verbs. And increasingly we're seeing this generalized so that all e-adjectives have an accent 1 from the end. In the past, there were also flat e-adjectives, but this difference has recently been lost a lot and will probably continue to become less common. So with these e-adjectives, with any one of these, you can safely put the accent 2nd from the end and you won't sound foreign. But I'll go through some of the sort of exceptions real quick. Yasashi is traditionally a flat adjective. So older people especially will still be saying yasashi and yasashiku, but we're seeing not only the plain dictionary form developing an accent as yasashi, but also the ku form is increasingly acceptable to be said as yasashiku instead of yasashiku. So I recommend, we don't really worry about this, but know it when you hear it. Muzukashi is not like yasashi in that it is only flat in dictionaries. For muzukashi, both accented and flat are both officially accepted. So it's pretty much the same deal as yasashi, but natives are going to think about it a little bit differently. And then kakkoi, I don't think we should think about at all because it's not actually an adjective. It's just 2 words that they're putting together because, I guess, for convenience. So no, this is not a single word. And we can know this because it can be split up, which you can't with a single word. So you can say kakkogai or kakkomoi, which you could not if it was a single word. And then the rest are just the same as all these. Just put the accent 3 from the end. What I will talk about real quick is some of the conjugations. In the past, the rule was, for instance, the ku form would move the accent back 1. So it would become, for instance, atsukute or samukute. But we're seeing a new trend of having the accent stay where it is. So it becomes samukute instead of samukute. And many natives will actually switch between these 2 patterns within the same conversation. So don't worry too much about this, actually. I love bringing you all good news, so there's a little bit. And then we can move on to na adjectives. So these, again, are going to have to be memorized because unlike e-adjectives, they don't follow such simple patterns, such consistent patterns. So ski is final high, skina, skida, right? Then kirai is flat, kirai, kiraina, kiraida. Daisuki is atamadaka, high, low. So daisuki. So remember, ski, and you're probably already saying this right because you can't exactly say suki. That you'd have to really work for that. So you're probably already saying this right, but especially as you're getting a better sense of the language, remember to keep this accent on the ki, skida, skina, right? Kirai, again, flat. Daisuki. Atamadaka, same deal with daikirai. And with daikirai, it can be said with a little small tsu here, so it becomes daikirai. And in this case, the energy from da can sort of carry over into the ki, so daikirai. So you may also hear it said like that, daikirai, daikirai. So keep a lookout for that. And then we have 3 in a row of atamadaka na adjectives. So kirei, genki, shizuka. All of these have the accent on the first mora. And there's nothing really crazy that happens here. Nigiyaka is nakadaka with the accent on the gi, nigiyaka. And then hima is flat, which, seems to be relatively rare with not adjectives, but in addition to kirai, we also have hima as being an unaccented one. So kirai na, hima toki, right? And then we move on to the verbs, and oyogu is accented. Oyogu, oyoideiru, right? Oyogu, there's an accent there. Now, kiku for ask or listen is flat. Kiku. Same deal with noru for ride or board, so it becomes noru. And yaru is also flat, so you might be mispronouncing it if you're trying to celebrate and you say yatta, but it's not, it's yatta, yatta. The energy, if you're going to put it there, which sort of creates an accent, is going to be on the end. It's going to be in the end of the word. Yatta, yatta. Moving on to the do verbs, we have dekakeru, which is flat. Now, there's a rule we're going to learn about where compound verbs tend to be accented, but this is one of the exceptions to that. Dekakeru, it's flat, so make sure to remember that, and we'll come back to that rule later. Ishoni is flat. You're not putting any accents here. And sugoku. I talked about the rules about how it can become like samukute, but I have not heard this said as sugoku. I think we should keep this as sugoku. And then daijoubu. This is nakadaka with the accent on joubu. On jo here, right? Daijoubu. And so because of this long vowel often getting reduced, so it becomes daijoubu. Daijoubu. Instead of daijoubu, it becomes daijoubu. The accent stays there though, so don't try to move it around when that happens. Totemo is flat, and thankfully there's nothing really funny going on here. Donna is accented, donna, but with the same as other question words we've talked about, there's a trend of changing this accent, so don't freak out if you hear it otherwise. Mai as the counter for flat objects typically has the accent go right before it, so 3 from the end. As that rule, as that old rule I mentioned says. The exception is before sang, and even with sang, it can still be said as sammai. It's just it can also be said as sammai, but you're going to say ichimai, so with the accent on the chi, ichimai, and nimai with the accent on the ni. So this shouldn't give you too much trouble. And that should be all for this lesson.